Well, before discussing ecologically sustainable energy, I'd just like to comment briefly on our Prime Minister's claim that coal is going to lift the poorest people in our world out of poverty. I think this is a very extraordinary claim. For a start, most poor rural villages are not connected to the electricity grid, and most of them never will be, and will never need to be, probably, because solar lighting, as you can see in that lower picture on the right, is now starting to spread. It's very inexpensive. A small solar collector with a battery, it's spreading through the poorer villages. And actually I stayed in a village on a tiny island with no power in Vanuatu, where they provided solar lighting. And lighting is one of the key things for development for the very poor, because it's affordable. Electric cooking is extremely unlikely to spread widely in the third world. There are efficient cook stoves with chimneys. You can see in that rather poor picture I took on the bottom left, they are starting to disseminate very slowly in villages in India and Bangladesh and other places. And they are much healthier, of course, than traditional cooking, which doesn't have a flue and in which the women and children choke, basically, in the air. So, really, to talk about coal power lifting people out of poverty is totally ridiculous. Now, in talking about, I've been asked to talk about renewable energy, but I really have to say that ecologically sustainable energy has first and foremost the efficient use of energy, or energy conservation, and that's the cheapest and fastest way to respond. You can often save a lot of money by implementing some of these technologies and measures, which I can't discuss in detail now, but they're there, they save money. Say that electric ceiling fan, which I installed in the house I've just moved into, uses 1/10 of electricity of the previous ceiling fan, which in turn uses far less than a reverse cycle air conditioner. Now, coming to renewable energy, how can it replace fossil fuels? And to understand this better, we need to consider that we use energy in three ways. We use it directly as electricity, such as what's lighting this room and powering this slideshow. And of course, in Australia, most electricity is coming from coal, although the coal fraction is declining quite steadily, which is great news, as is the total demand for electricity on the grid. Now, I'm going to mention that, in fact, research at this university and many other institutes around the world show that in many places the whole electricity generating system could be run entirely off renewable sources of energy, which are technologies which are commercially available now. So I'm not talking about some dream technology of the future. Most non-electrical heat at present could be provided either by renewable electricity or low temperature solar thermal collectors. And the only real problem in going to 100% renewable energy is in some areas of transport. In urban transport, there's a much bigger role potentially for active transport, walking and cycling, and better public transport. And for those trips that can't be fulfilled that way, electric vehicles charged from renewable sources can play a big role. But we do have a gap with long-distance rural transport, which can't be provided by electric vehicles, and air transport. And at present, the only solution there is potentially biofuels. So I'm going to focus on electricity, because if we go to a sustainable energy future, electricity will play a much greater role, together with improved energy efficiency and conservation. One of the features of renewable electricity is its diversity. We can't run an electricity grid on wind power alone, or on solar PV alone, but we're fortunate to be blessed, especially in Australia, with a huge diversity of sources which have different statistical properties. So when we put them all together, we can produce a system that is highly reliable, just as reliable as the existing polluting system. There are also more local jobs in renewable energy, and in fact in 2012 there were 24,000 direct jobs in renewable energy in Australia. This could be compared with about 10,000 direct jobs in coal mining and electricity generation from coal for use in Australia. Of course, most of our coal is actually exported, and there are some more jobs there. But since 2012, we have come into a period of federal and state government policies that are trying to stop the growth of renewable energy, and several thousand of those 24,000 direct jobs have already been lost. And if the renewable energy target is axed, there will be huge job losses, many thousand more. There are several countries now that are, and states or provinces of countries that are really moving towards 100%, 80 to 100% renewable electricity in their official programs. And Denmark and Germany, Scotland are really good examples. China now has quite a substantial target for renewable energy, even for 2020, 20% of all primary energy, not just electricity, from renewables. It has the world's biggest wind power capacity, the world's biggest solar hot water capacity and manufacture, and it's the world's biggest manufacturer of solar PV. South Australia, a third of its electricity averaged over the year comes from the wind, 5% from rooftop solar, and it has a target of 50% renewable electricity, actually by 2025, subject to the renewable energy target being kept. Some states in Germany are already generating over 100% renewable electricity, but they can do that because they have strong transmission connection to neighbouring states. So they buy and sell electricity over the power lines. Renewable energy, as I'm sure you all know, is under attack by both federal and most state governments and most electricity utilities. Probably the principal concern right now is the struggle to maintain the renewable energy target, which is the principal driver of renewable energy during this transition in Australia. And as you know, that was assessed by a panel of people, not one of whom has any known knowledge of renewable energy, but with strong commitments to fossil fuels and nuclear energy. So we're seeing the attempts to axe the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, which does R&D, and its funding has already been cut substantially, actually by the previous Labor government as well as the current coalition government. The current government wants to close the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. If it can get that through the Senate, that's financing the valley of death, as it's called, between demonstrating a technology and moving to early commercialisation. It's levering private finance very successfully, and it's actually making a profit, but they still want to close it. And the list goes on. And then there are all these anti-renewable energy myths that are being spread by vested interests and the politicians who are linked to those interests. But without going through them, the guts of it are that renewable energy is allegedly too unreliable, that it needs continuous backup from coal-fired power stations. All that is nonsense, as you'll see. It's too expensive, too diffuse, that it's not ready. It's responsible for big increases in electricity prices, that wind and solar have severe environmental and health impacts, and so on. And all these myths are either grossly exaggerated or totally untrue and have been disproven. So why do we see these attacks? Apart from the vested interests in the big greenhouse gas emitting industries and state government revenue in some states, where they take the profit from electricity sales, the electricity utility business models are collapsing with the growth of renewable energy. And we see two effects. At the wholesale end, that's the generation end, particularly in South Australia, wind farms with their very low operating costs are actually displacing the existing coal-fired stations. So contrary to the notion that coal has to run continuously as backup, in South Australia, one of the 2 coal-fired stations there has been closed down for the whole year, and the other of the 2 has been closed for half a year at a time, and its lifetime is not likely to be very long. There are some gas-fired stations in South Australia. They have not increased the number of gas stations. So with 33% and possibly this year 40% of renewable electricity coming from the wind, South Australia is still producing a reliable system. So that's at the wholesale level. And at the retail level, because there's been for the last 5 years a decline in demand for electricity from the grid, the utility business models are collapsing as solar PV on rooftops grows, as the high retail electricity prices encourage people not only to install PV but also to use electricity less wastefully. So the utility response, after initially trying to raise electricity prices, which simply push them further into that death spiral, they are now raising the fixed price that we all pay. So we pay for the energy we use, but we also, even if we use no electricity, we pay a fixed charge, a daily charge, between 70 and $1 something, $1.20 a day. And they're raising that now. Batteries are still too expensive for most people to disconnect from the grid, but they are declining in price slowly. So we can bust these myths both by practical experience, looking at what's happened in South Australia that I just mentioned, and similarly in Denmark, where the grid is coping with large amounts of renewable energy, and supplemented by hour-by-hour computer simulations of the operation of electricity systems. And that's one of the projects that we're doing at this university. So every hour, using real data on electricity demand, on wind and sunshine over the whole region of the national electricity market, we are trying to balance supply and demand each hour. And we find that we can do that with the same reliability as the existing system, even with that mix that you can see there of sources. So that shows the annual electricity generation contribution by different sources. Wind 46%, solar PV 20%, concentrated solar thermal 22%, existing hydro 6%, and gas turbines burning renewable gases and liquids 6%. That's our published work, and you can see that 2/3 of that annual electricity is coming from the very variable sources, wind and solar PV, without storage, and is still reliable. Now, our latest work, which we haven't yet submitted for publication, is we've made our wind sources more geographically distributed, and we're now getting 60% wind contributing, and still a reliable system, and only 2% of the gaps filled with these gas turbines, which are basically jet engines burning renewable fuels. That shows that the bars show the different greenhouse gas emissions from 4 different potential alternatives to 100% renewables. Starting on the left, efficient fossil, so you can see very high greenhouse gas emissions, almost as high as the current system. Combined cycle gas turbine, that's an all gas one. It reduces the emissions, at least if you average over 100 years, but still very high. And then the 2 bars on the right are coal and gas with carbon capture and storage, which is an unproven technology on scale. And we've done the economics of those alternatives, and it turns out that if we use the government's projections of the future costs of renewable energy technologies in 2030, then the efficient fossil scenario is actually cheaper than 100% renewables, but by a few $1 billion a year. But on the other hand, if you use Bloomberg New Energy Finance figures, then in fact the 100% renewables is cost effective now. The gas scenario cannot compete with 100% renewables as gas prices are going up being dragged up to export prices at present. That's already happened in Queensland, and it's well on the way to New South Wales. And if in New South Wales gas prices reach export prices, which are 3 times domestic prices, or they were 3 times, the gap is shrinking, then there is no way that gas can compete with 100% renewables. This is all published work. Carbon capture and storage, because the technology is unproven, we've taken a wide range of cost figures, and we find that only under extraordinary circumstances, excuse me, could coal with carbon capture and storage or gas with carbon capture and storage compete with 100% renewables. So we need some real policies, and sadly many of these that I've listed here are policies which the present federal and some state governments are trying to terminate. So we actually need stronger greenhouse targets, not only for 2020 but for 2030. We need to reintroduce a carbon price, and I would say preferably as a tax rather than emissions trading scheme, because it's so easy to fudge emissions trading schemes, to produce a scheme that looks impressive but does nothing. We need to terminate the very large subsidies to the production and use of fossil fuels. They're over $10 billion a year. We need to actually increase the renewable energy target, as I said. We need to keep ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. We need to ensure that fair feed-in tariffs are set for electricity, renewable electricity fed back into the grid. Some utilities now are paying zero. For example, my utility pays zero for solar fed into the grid. Others are paying up to 8 cents a kilowatt hour, but retail prices are 28 cents a kilowatt hour if you buy from the grid. We need to upgrade the transmission system for large-scale renewables, and a high priority is to join South Australia directly to New South Wales through Broken Hill. And that would not only allow South Australia to install even more wind power that could be fed to the eastern states, it would bring in solar from Western New South Wales, and if hot rock geothermal power ever becomes viable, it could feed into that grid at Broken Hill. And on energy efficiency, we desperately need to expand our energy ratings for buildings and electrical appliances and other equipment. We need mandatory energy labelling for everything that uses energy and mandatory energy performance standards. We've made a start in those areas, but it's not comprehensive, and as far as buildings goes, it doesn't really apply to existing buildings at present, unlike, say, in Denmark. So what can we do? Almost there. I believe we need to act at 3 different levels: household, community, and large-scale social and political action in states and national scales. Household action, of course, is important. It spreads the message, but only 1/4 of our energy use is actually household. I mean, it's the products we buy that are made by industries and so on that produce most of the energy in the greenhouse gas emissions. But we can act then at a community level. We're starting to see the growth of community renewable energy projects in Australia. These have been the basis of the huge solar and wind industries in Northern Europe, in Germany, in Denmark and so on. Community projects. And in Australia, we've just started. We've got 2 community wind farms. We have about 12 community solar projects operating, and maybe 60 projects in the development scale, and we could have hundreds or thousands. And then at the large scale, we really need to organise better, to campaign politically, whether one does it through non-party political sources like GetUp and other community groups, or within or against political parties. One of the very successful things that is happening right now is the campaign by the Australian Solar Council, which is holding public meetings in marginal seats around the country, and is getting typically 400 to 500 people at these meetings to defend the renewable energy target. In many of these seats, the margin at the last election is less than 400. And that, I believe, has already made an impact on the present government with stepping back from its initial desire to cancel the small-scale renewable energy scheme. Okay, I better stop there. Time's out. There's more information in my new book that was mentioned before, Sustainable Energy Solutions for Climate Change, and I've brought a few copies for sale at wholesale price if anyone would like to see me afterwards. Thank you very much.